I hadn't planned to be alone with her. It was supposed to be a quick stop. My friend had asked me to drop by, said he'd be home soon. But when I knocked on the door, it was his mother who answered. She stood there, framed in the doorway, sunlight brushing over her shoulder. Her smile was warm, practiced, the kind you offer to someone you've known for years but never really looked at. I'd been in their house countless times before, yet that moment felt strangely new, like seeing her not as my friend's mom, but simply as a woman. "Come in," she said, stepping aside. Her voice carried a calm, measured tone, touched with a hint of curiosity. The house smelled faintly of fresh lemons, like she'd been cleaning, and something about that simple domestic detail made me feel both welcome and a little out of place. I set my bag down and explained that her son had told me to wait. She nodded, motioning toward the kitchen. "Then you'll need something cold to drink. It's far too warm outside." I followed her in, trying to act casual, though every sense felt oddly heightened. The sound of her footsteps across the tiled floor. The quiet swish of fabric when she moved. Even the way the light caught the faint lines near her eyes when she smiled at me, marks of experience, but softened by grace. She poured iced tea into a tall glass, the clink of ice against glass crisp in the silence. Sliding it across the counter, she leaned just slightly closer than she needed to. A faint trace of perfume, floral, understated, lingered in the air between us. "Thank you," I said, lifting the glass. The condensation was cool against my fingers, grounding me, while everything else felt unsteady. She didn't rush to leave the room. Instead, she rested her hand lightly against the edge of the counter, studying me with an attentiveness I wasn't used to. It wasn't the kind of look adults usually give when they half listen out of politeness. No, she was really looking. "So," she asked, tilting her head just a little, "how have you been? Still working long hours?" Her tone was casual, but the question seemed to reach past the surface. I found myself answering more honestly than I intended, telling her about the late nights, the restless feeling that came with not knowing if I was moving forward fast enough in life. She listened with a quiet focus, nodding slowly, her lips pressed into a thoughtful smile. And in that moment, I realized something unsettling. I wanted her to keep asking me questions. I wanted her attention, her interest, in a way I shouldn't have. The silence stretched, not uncomfortable but thick with something I couldn't name. She finally broke it with a soft laugh, brushing her hand over the counter as if smoothing out invisible wrinkles. "My son will be sorry to keep you waiting," she said, eyes sparkling faintly. "But I don't mind the company." The words were light, harmless on the surface. Yet in the way she said them, paired with the lingering smile she gave me, they carried a weight I couldn't ignore. And so the evening began, not with my friend, but with his mother. We sat in the living room, the late afternoon light spilling in through the curtains, painting the furniture in a soft golden hue. I settled on the couch, while she took the armchair across from me. It should have felt like any ordinary visit, like so many afternoons I'd spent here before, but there was a subtle shift in the air, something quieter, more attentive. She asked me about work again, her voice calm and deliberate. Not the kind of polite, passing question people usually ask, but one weighted with genuine curiosity. "Do you enjoy what you're doing?" she asked, resting her chin lightly against her hand. I hesitated. Normally, with adults, I'd keep it short, offer something vague to move the conversation along. But something about her gaze made it difficult to hide behind easy answers. Her eyes were steady, warm, and unblinking, as though she could sense the truth behind whatever I might try to disguise. So I admitted it, the long hours, the doubts, the gnawing uncertainty of whether I was building something worthwhile or simply wasting time. She listened without interrupting, her lips parting just slightly now and then, as if she wanted to interject but chose instead to let me speak freely. When I paused, she smiled, not in amusement, but in understanding. "You sound a lot older than you are," she said softly, "but maybe that's not a bad thing." I laughed quietly, unsure how to take the compliment. "And you?" I asked, almost without thinking. "Do you enjoy what you're doing?" The question seemed to catch her off guard. She straightened a little, brushing her fingers over the arm of her chair. For a moment, her expression slipped into something more vulnerable. "Most days, yes. But," she exhaled, her voice dropping, "there are times I wonder if people really see me anymore, beyond the roles I fill." Her words lingered in the space between us. I felt a strange ache in my chest, as though she had admitted something she rarely said aloud. And I couldn't help noticing the way she sat back then, her shoulders just slightly drawn inward, a quiet echo of that confession. "I see you," I heard myself say, the words out before I could second-guess them. She looked up at me, startled at first, then softened into a smile that seemed more genuine than any I had seen from her before. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen filled the silence. She lifted her hand, brushing a loose strand of hair behind her ear, the motion slow and thoughtful, and I found myself watching far too closely. Her laughter came next, gentle, almost musical. "You always did have a way of saying things you didn't realize carried weight," she teased. But the way her eyes lingered on me, steady and unhurried, betrayed that she had felt it too. And just like that, what had begun as a casual conversation drifted into something else entirely, something that made the minutes stretch and the air feel heavier, as though the house itself was holding its breath, waiting to see where our words would take us next. At some point, she rose from her chair, her movements unhurried, graceful in the quiet rhythm of the house. "Come on," she said with a soft smile, "let's sit somewhere more comfortable." Her tone was casual, but I felt something shift when she said let's. I followed her into the living room's cozier corner, where a lamp glowed warmly beside the sofa. She sat first, tucking one leg beneath her, leaving space beside her that felt more like an invitation than an accident. I hesitated a moment before lowering myself onto the cushion, not too close, not too far, aware of every inch between us. The room seemed quieter now. The air heavier. We slipped easily into another conversation, though this time it carried more laughter than the one before. She teased me about a story I'd shared, the way I always manage to overthink, to stumble into small mistakes because I'm too wrapped up in details. I grinned, pretending to protest, but the truth was I enjoyed the way she looked at me when she laughed. It wasn't the laugh itself, though that was warm and genuine. It was the way she leaned just slightly toward me when it came, the way her eyes softened, the corners of her lips curling with something more tender than amusement. And then it happened. In one of those easy, joking moments, her hand drifted across the cushion, brushing against my forearm. Not a firm grip, not a deliberate move. Just a light touch, her fingertips resting briefly against my skin as she made a point. But the effect was anything but casual. Her touch was warm, startling in its simplicity. The kind of warmth that seemed to sink beneath the skin, leaving a trace long after she pulled away. My breath caught, though I hoped she didn't notice. I forced a smile, tried to keep the conversation going, but all I could feel was the memory of her hand against me, a sensation both fleeting and impossibly lasting. She must have realized it too, because her smile shifted, softening, holding something just beneath the surface. She withdrew her hand slowly, almost reluctantly, her fingers grazing the fabric of the sofa as though to disguise what had just happened. The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was charged. I dared a glance at her, and found her already watching me. For a second, just one suspended moment, our eyes locked in a way that made the rest of the room dissolve. The lamplight painted her features in warm gold, and in that look there was something unspoken, something neither of us could put into words without breaking the fragile spell between us. She was the first to look away, her smile returning, gentle but layered now with an unacknowledged truth. "You're easy to talk to," she said, her voice softer than before. I nodded, unable to find the right reply, still replaying the feel of her hand against my arm. It was nothing. Just a touch. And yet, it was everything. Evening crept in slowly, almost unnoticed. One moment the room was bathed in gold, the next it had dimmed into a softer, quieter blue. She switched on the lamp beside the sofa, and the glow settled around us like a blanket, warm and protective, as though the outside world no longer existed. We had drifted into a kind of calm silence, the kind that doesn't demand to be filled. I sipped what was left of my drink, the ice now melted, while she sat angled slightly toward me, her legs curled beneath her. The casualness of the posture was disarming, intimate, unguarded. Then she spoke, almost to herself at first. "Sometimes," she said, staring into the soft light, "the hardest part of being here is how invisible I can feel." Her words struck me, not loud, but deep. I turned to her, but she kept her gaze on the lamp, as though she wasn't ready to meet my eyes. Her fingers tapped lightly against her knee, betraying a nervous energy. "Invisible?" I repeated quietly, prompting her gently. She gave a faint smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "It's not anyone's fault. Life just moves on. The kids grow up. People stop asking about your dreams. You become the one holding everything together, and in the process, you forget what it felt like to be truly seen." I felt something tighten in my chest. It was strange. I hadn't come here expecting to hear her heart laid bare, but in that moment, it felt like she was trusting me with something precious, fragile. Without thinking, I leaned forward slightly. "I see you," I said softly. Her head turned then, her eyes meeting mine at last. For a heartbeat, there was surprise in them, and then something else, something warmer, softer, that made the air between us heavy. She studied me for a long moment, as though searching to see if I meant it. And I did. Not in some casual way, not as a reflexive comfort. I meant it. Her lips parted, a breath escaping, and she set her teacup down carefully on the table, her hands trembling just enough for me to notice. "You don't realize how rare it is to hear that," she whispered. I hesitated, then admitted more than I intended. I know what it's like, too. To feel out of place. To wonder if anyone's paying attention. Maybe that's why this feels different. Her eyes softened, and for a moment I thought she might look away. But she didn't. She held my gaze, and in it I saw a mirror of my own longing, not for anything reckless, but for connection, for acknowledgement, for someone who understood. The silence after that was thick, almost fragile. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen, the tick of the clock on the wall, and beneath it all, the sound of her breathing, steady but slower now. She gave a small smile, one touched with sadness but also gratitude. "You're far too young to understand this kind of loneliness," she said softly. "Maybe," I admitted, "but I understand yours." Her eyes shimmered in the lamplight, and she leaned back slowly, as though retreating before the moment carried her too far. But the look she left me with was enough, an unspoken acknowledgement that the boundary between us had thinned, that something had shifted, and neither of us could pretend otherwise. The house had grown quiet. Too quiet. The kind of stillness that makes you aware of your own breathing, of how close you are to another person. My friend was still nowhere to be found, and in his absence, time felt strangely suspended. She rose from the sofa and walked toward the window, pulling the curtain back just enough to glance outside. The street lamps had flickered on, scattering pools of amber light along the pavement. She lingered there a moment, her silhouette framed against the dim glass, before she turned back toward me. "You've grown up," she said softly, almost to herself. I wasn't sure how to answer, so I smiled instead. She crossed the room, not hurriedly, but with a kind of quiet certainty, and sat down beside me this time, not across from me, not with a safe distance, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from her. She leaned in slightly, as though inspecting something on my shirt, then reached out. Her fingers brushed against my chest, delicate, searching for some invisible thread. She pinched it away and let her hand fall, but not before her fingertips lingered longer than they needed to. The touch was small, almost nothing at all. But my heart reacted as though she had whispered something dangerous. "There," she said with a faint smile, "perfect." Her tone was light, but her eyes told a different story. They lingered on mine, unflinching, the air between us charged with everything unspoken. I tried to steady my breath, but the closeness was overwhelming. The faint scent of her perfume clung to the air, soft, floral, and impossibly distracting. I managed a quiet laugh, trying to shake the weight of the moment. "You didn't have to fix that." "Maybe I wanted to," she replied, her voice low, carrying a trace of playfulness. For a long moment, neither of us looked away. Her hand rested on her lap now, but it shifted slightly, as though tempted to move closer. The space between our shoulders felt impossibly small, and I could sense the warmth of her arm, like an invisible thread pulling me toward her. Her lips curved into the kind of smile that carried more meaning than words ever could, a smile of understanding, of quiet daring, of secrets waiting to be spoken. It wasn't bold, not reckless, but it was charged with a subtle defiance, a question hanging in the air. I swallowed hard, my throat suddenly dry. "What are you thinking?" I asked, the words trembling out before I could stop them. She tilted her head, her gaze softening. "That some things don't need to be explained," she said. Her smile deepened, tender and knowing. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was delicate, fragile, like glass you didn't dare touch for fear it might shatter. Her hand shifted just slightly closer to mine on the sofa cushion. Not touching, not yet. But close enough that every nerve in my hand was alive with anticipation. And in that space, that almost touch, that lingering smile, I realized she was no longer just my friend's mother. She was a woman, and I was a man, and something unspoken between us had just quietly changed forever. The clock on the wall ticked softly, each second louder than it should have been in the hush of the room. Neither of us spoke. We just sat there, shoulders almost touching, the silence pulsing with an energy I couldn't name but couldn't ignore. Her fingers moved first. A small shift, so subtle it might have gone unnoticed if I hadn't been waiting for it. She let her hand drift across the cushion until the side of her palm brushed lightly against mine. The touch was delicate, tentative, but it was real. I froze, breath caught in my throat. Then, slowly, as though guided by instinct, I let my hand turn upward. Her fingers slipped into mine, soft and warm, their weight feather-light yet impossibly grounding. She didn't look at me at first. Instead, she let her gaze settle downward, watching our hands, studying the simple connection as though it were something fragile. Only after a long pause did she lift her eyes to mine. "Promise me," she whispered, her voice hushed, carrying both playfulness and something far more serious beneath it. My lips parted, but no sound came. I could feel her pulse against my palm, a faint, steady rhythm that matched my own. "Promise you what?" I asked finally, though my voice was barely more than a breath. Her smile curved gently, a mixture of mischief and vulnerability. She leaned closer, her shoulder brushing mine, her words so near I could feel the warmth of them against my skin. "Promise me, this will be our little secret." The weight of her request fell over me like a blanket, thrilling, terrifying, intoxicating all at once. It wasn't a demand, it was a plea wrapped in a smile, a request made not from authority but from trust. I looked at her, at the way her eyes held both defiance and fear, at the way her lips lingered on the edge of a smile that couldn't quite hide her trembling. And in that instant, I understood, this wasn't about scandal or recklessness. It was about being seen, about protecting something tender and rare. I nodded slowly. "I promise." The words felt heavier than they should have. Not because I didn't mean them, I did, but because I knew what they implied. That what passed between us tonight would belong to us alone. A hidden thread no one else could see. Her smile softened at my reply, relief flickering across her face. She gave my hand the gentlest squeeze, and for a moment neither of us let go. The warmth of her palm seeped into me, steadying, almost protective. We sat like that, hands intertwined, shoulders touching, wrapped in silence. I could hear the faint ticking of the clock, the hum of the lamp, and the quiet sound of her breathing beside me. Everything else faded. And in that fragile moment, sealed by her whisper, by my promise, the boundary we had carefully skirted dissolved. We hadn't crossed into recklessness, not yet, but we had stepped firmly into something we both understood, a secret, fragile, and ours alone. The sound of a car pulling into the driveway broke the spell. Headlights swept briefly across the curtains, a reminder that time hadn't stopped after all, even though it had felt that way inside these walls. She released my hand quickly, almost guiltily, though the warmth of her touch clung to me like an imprint. She smoothed her hair with one hand, the other adjusting the hem of her blouse, small gestures of composure that only made her vulnerability clearer. "My son's home," she murmured, her voice low, as though the very act of saying it snapped us both back into the reality we'd been trying to ignore. I nodded, though my chest tightened. The moment we had shared, the closeness, the promise, already felt like something that belonged to another world, one that would vanish the second her son stepped through the door. Footsteps crunched on the gravel outside, followed by the familiar slam of a car door. She looked at me then, her eyes steady, her expression unreadable. And yet, just at the corner of her mouth, that same smile lingered, the smile that carried our secret. She whispered, just before he opened the front door, "Don't forget what you promised." And then the house filled again with noise. My friend called out from the hallway, his voice casual, unaware of the silence he'd just interrupted. She rose gracefully, greeting him as though nothing had happened, her tone steady, warm, maternal. I gathered my bag, willing my hands not to shake. We exchanged only the most ordinary words as I left. "Thanks for the tea." "You're welcome. Come by any time." Harmless, forgettable. Words that would dissolve instantly in the air. But her eyes told me everything I needed to remember. I stepped out into the cool night, the door closing softly behind me. The air was sharp, the sky deep with stars, but none of it could quiet the echo of what had just unfolded inside. I walked slowly down the driveway, the gravel crunching underfoot, each step pulling me further away from her presence and yet binding me tighter to the memory of it. I could still feel her hand in mine, the warmth of her fingers slipping into my palm as if they had belonged there all along. I could still hear the softness of her voice, the way it trembled when she asked me for a promise. And that smile, that secret smile, followed me into the night. As I reached the end of the street, I glanced back once, half expecting to see her at the window. But the curtains were drawn, the house dark and ordinary again, as though nothing had happened. Yet I knew better. Something had shifted tonight, something invisible but undeniable. A quiet bond, a whispered secret, a fragile thread woven between us. It wasn't love, not yet. It wasn't even something I could name. But it was ours, and for now, that was enough. I walked on, carrying her smile with me like a lantern in the dark.